was increasingly conscious of grounds for unease in the development of the campaign. The unending immensity of the land depressed many soldiers. Lack of mobility, particularly of tracked vehicles, was a severe drawback. There continued to be a huge haul of prisoners, but the German pincers were closing too slowly, allowing large numbers of Red Army troops to get away, and the Red Army appeared to command endless reserves. Most roads were of dirt, which, with the sudden rains turning quickly to mud, halted entire columns. Meanwhile, Hitler was vacillating. Having failed to annihilate the Red Army, his interest turned towards securing the economic prize of the Ukrainian oil wells. To Guderian's dismay, he was diverted from his plan to drive hard and fast for Moscow. The capture of the Russian capital would have been a profound psychological shock for the Soviets. Instead, Guderian was ordered south to the Ukraine to link up with Hoth. His division still performed outstandingly, helping to take well over 500,000 prisoners and nearly 1,000 tanks. But the crucial moment of the campaign had already passed. The Germans were confronted with another and equally unpleasant surprise at this time. The first Russian T-34 tanks appeared during the Battle of Vyazma. At Berea, the Russian tanks simply drove straight through the 7th Infantry Division onto the artillery positions and literally ran over the guns. The effect on the infantrymen's morale was devastating. This marked the beginning of what came to be called the Tank Terror.
We've come here to Norfolk, to the Muckleborough collection, to have a look at this, the T-34. In many respects, this is the vehicle that actually won the Second World War. They were manufactured in such quantity that they swamped the German forces, and they really had no answer to the sheer numbers of T-34s which appeared on the battlefield. There were something like 50,000 of these that were manufactured during the war period. It's by no means a beautifully finished machine, but it was solid and it was very, very workmanlike. When you consider that there were only something like 1,700 Tigers which were manufactured, they had to face 50,000 of these, and on the Allied side, 50,000 Shermans allied to all the British types. So you can appreciate that it didn't have to be the best tank in the world, but in many respects it was a very, very solid performer. It was made with the Russian conditions in mind. It had wide tracks, it had the simple suspension based on the Christie model, and this tank really had everything that was needed to allow it to be mass-produced in the Russian economy in the kind of numbers that arrived just in time. And there's no doubt that a tank like a Tiger was a far better machine. It was better engineered, it had a bigger, harder hitting gun, and it was better protected. But what they couldn't cope with were the numbers of these medium tanks, which weighed in at around 30 tons, but could move quickly and above all could deal with the Russian mud and the snow in a way that until the advent of the later German tanks, none of the early models could.
It was absolutely different to everything else what was available then. Strong armor, sloping armor. Machine guns fitted, one here for the radio operator to fire from, another coaxial one to be fired out of that hole, and this other hole is for the gun layer to look through and lay the gun. Driver sits here, and next to him is the radio operator, as I said, who will fire the gun. And the other three men, the commander, the early one did not have a commander as such. The commander at the top with the vision all round, the gun layer and the loader, which was quite a difficult job in there. The T-34 embodied everything as close as possible to perfection which could be expected from a tank at the time. Speed, protection, firepower, and most of all reliability, because that's the worst thing which could happen on a tank, especially on a modern German tank at the time, to break down somewhere miles from anywhere and not be able to get going. This, as I said earlier, is an 85mm gun, which was very, very good, but the Russian optics bulbs were not quite as good as the Germans, which meant lesser shells hit their target than they might have done on the German Tiger, for instance. One of the best things on this tank, well, everything is good, as I said earlier, but one of the best reliable things is the engine itself. Now, this tank was made in 1943, but the engine hasn't changed very much to this very day. Actually, the very same engine with a slightly higher power output is put in the T-55. The very same engine develops about 30 or 40 more horsepower, that's all. Designed in the very early 40s and still up to date. If you look closely on this edge, you see how rough the manufacture of the tank was. I mean, it's unbelievable. Here, the hole didn't quite line up, so with a burner they cut the hole a bit bigger, you see. But they turned out 45,000 of these things, you see. They knew very well it hasn't got a long life expectancy, so a little bit rough edge or thereabouts didn't matter. The enormous turret, if you take a look at that, it's very heavy. You wouldn't think anybody could move it. But let me tell you, if that tank gets a direct hit, a armor-penetrating shell inside, and sets off its own ammunition by it, the whole turret, as it is, will be blown sky high and sail through the air 10 or 12 yards. That's the force of an exploding tank. Its own ammunition and its own petrol, diesel, what have you.
In 1941, the T-34 was impervious to the infantry's anti-tank weapons. At that time, the German infantry was equipped only with 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns. But they had no effect on the T-34. A gun of at least 75mm caliber was needed, but it first had to be designed and built. In the meantime, only 88mm anti-aircraft guns could be relied upon, and those were hurriedly pressed into the anti-tank role. Still, Russia was not defeated. By the end of August, 5,300,000 men had been mobilized. Stalin had emerged from his isolation to broadcast a message of patriotism and resistance to the nation. For once, the Russian people were told the truth. Stalin now took direct control of the Red Army. The pre-war complacency which he himself had done so much to foster had now rapidly to be undone. But the general mobilization of Russian troops failed to curtail the German advance. 4 reserve armies of 37 divisions were dispatched to bolster the West Front in the general area of Smolensk. The Germans countered with yet another encirclement, and the panzer groups of Generals Hoth and Guderian smashed through the Soviet line and maneuvered 300,000 Russian troops into an indefensible pocket. Another 150,000 prisoners, 2,000 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces fell into German hands. Drunk with anticipation, Goebbels announced that the eastern continent lies like a limp virgin in the mighty arms of the German Mars. Spurred on by the successful actions of their commands, the men of Army Group South finally broke through the Russian Southwest Front, and another pocket yielded a further toll of 100,000 prisoners. At the outbreak of war in the East, the backbone of the Panzer Corps was the Panzer Mark IV. Designed by Krupp and weighing 17.3 tons, the Panzer Kampfwagen IV carried a crew of 5 at a maximum speed of 18.5 miles an hour. Its armor varied in thickness from 8 to 30 centimeters, and it was armed with a 75mm turret gun and 2 machine guns. Supported by the lighter Mark III, which was similar in size and appearance, the Mark IV swept all before it until the Russian T-34 tank made its appearance in numbers. Despite the confusion which surrounded her armed forces, the Red Army had tried in 1940 and 1941 to bring in 2 new tanks. The T-34, which had been successfully tested in 1939, and the heavier KV-1 tank. But so far they only produced about 1,000 of each. The T-34s and KV-1s were distributed in very small packets on a battlefront about 2,000 miles long. Nonetheless, when they did meet German armor, it did come as an enormous shock the first time that the Germans encountered them. particularly the T-34.